The darkness of the English countryside, after midnight, isn't just an absence of light, it's a physical weight. It presses against the glass of a moving train, eager to fracture it and spill inside. Once the blinding, neon glow of London bleeds away into nothingness, the windows of a late night commuter train cease to be portals to the outside world. Deprived of street lamps, illuminated houses, or even moonlight, they transform into something far more unsettling. Against the pitch black canvas of the rural night, they become absolute, perfect black mirrors. And the terrifying thing about mirrors is the blind trust we place in them. You only trust a mirror because you believe it is bound by the laws of physics to reflect the truth. But what happens when the glass decides to show you something else entirely? It was a Tuesday night, though technically we had crossed into the desolate hours of Wednesday morning. My partner Elena and I were taking the 11:45 p.m. of train out of London Victoria, heading home to our quiet, deeply isolated village at the very end of the commuter line. We had attended a friend's reception in the city, a rare occasion that kept us out past our usual hours. By the time the train rattled past the suburban sprawl and plunged into the sprawling, forested valleys of the countryside, our carriage had completely emptied out. We were the last souls on board. "God, my feet are killing me," Elena mumbled, kicking off her heels and pulling her legs beneath her on the blue moquette seat. She leaned her head against the freezing glass, pulling her scarf up to her chin. "Wake me up when we hit the valley, Artie. I can't keep my eyes open." Within minutes, she surrendered to her exhaustion. Her breathing grew deep and rhythmic, undisturbed by the violent swaying of the carriage. I, however, was hopelessly awake, wired on the adrenaline of city navigation and 3 double espressos. My hyper-vigilance forced me to catalog every sensory detail. The carriage was bathed in the sterile, jaundiced glare of fluorescent lights overhead. The only sounds were the monotonous, hypnotic clack, 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 clack of the iron wheels devouring the tracks, and the low, mechanical drone of the diesel engine. To pass the time, I found myself staring blankly into the window directly across the aisle. Because of the impenetrable blackness of the night outside, the glass functioned as a flawless, high-definition mirror. I could clearly see my own exhausted face, pale under the synthetic lighting. Beyond my reflection, I saw the empty blue seats stretching in symmetrical rows all the way to the automated sliding glass doors at the rear. It was a perfectly static, perfectly lonely scene. Until the train began to slow down, the intercom crackled, breaking the silence with a burst of static. "We are now approaching Blackwood Cross. Please mind the gap." A Blackwood Cross was a notoriously desolate transit point, little more than a cracked concrete platform marooned in the middle of a dense pine forest. As the train screeched to a halt, I peered through my reflection to look outside. The scene was utterly barren. A single, failing halogen bulb flickered erratically. Dead autumn leaves blew in violent spirals across the concrete. Not a single soul stood waiting in the biting cold. With a pneumatic sigh, the doors slid open. A rush of freezing night air swept through the carriage, carrying the distinct, melancholic scent of damp earth and rotting pine needles. We waited in total silence for a full minute. Nobody boarded. Nobody disembarked. The doors hissed shut, sealing us back inside our brightly lit metal tube. The train lurched forward, slowly gathering speed as it plunged aggressively back into the suffocating abyss of the forest. I let out a long breath, leaned my head back, and casually turned my eyes to the window to watch the reflection of our empty carriage once more. That was when the nightmare began. My breath instantly seized. My heart performed a violent somersault against my ribs, suddenly pounding so hard I could hear the blood roaring in my ears. In the reflection of the glass, at the absolute rear of the carriage, the automated sliding doors were slowly closing. And standing just inside our car, having apparently just stepped silently through them, was a man. I froze. Total physiological paralysis gripped me. Every primal survival instinct screamed that something was fundamentally wrong, yet my desperate mind scrambled to build a logical bridge. Someone must have walked between the carriages. A late night drifter. But I hadn't heard the heavy doors slide open. I hadn't heard the hiss of hydraulics. I hadn't heard a single footstep. Through the black mirror of the window, I watched him. He was walking down the center aisle, moving directly toward the backs of our seats. But he didn't walk like a living person. He moved with an agonizing, disjointed slowness. It was a heavy, labored shuffle. He was violently dragging his right leg behind him, as if the limb were completely shattered and devoid of bone, dragging an invisible anchor chain to his ankle. Despite my panic, the horrific details burned themselves into my retinas. He was exceptionally tall, though his posture was violently hunched. He wore a thick, double-breasted wool overcoat, a style decades out of fashion. The coat was pitch black and completely, impossibly saturated with water. In the reflection, dark, heavy droplets fell constantly from the hem of his coat. They splashed onto the scuffed linoleum floor. Silently, he was dripping wet, stepping heavily, dragging a dead limb. Yet the carriage was absolutely devoid of any sound besides the clack of the tracks. His collar was turned sharply up, and a battered fedora was pulled low over his brow, casting his face in an impenetrable shadow. But the most terrifying aspect was the physical aura of misery, decay, and freezing cold radiating from him. As he shuffled closer in the reflection, the ambient temperature in our carriage plummeted. It was the sharp, biting cold of a meat locker. The condensation on the window beside me suddenly crystallized into frost. I gasped, and a thick plume of white vapor expelled from my mouth. Clack, 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 clack. I couldn't look away from the glass. I was trapped in absolute, horrific fascination. The muscles in my neck were locked tight. I couldn't scream. I couldn't wake Alina. In the reflection, the dripping man reached our row. I gripped my armrests so hard my knuckles turned bruised white. I braced myself. I waited agonizingly to hear the wet, heavy rustle of his wool coat in the physical world. I waited to hear the thud of his boots on the floor, just inches from my actual shoulder. In the window's reflection, the man stopped. He stood perfectly still for a terrifying second. Then, he turned his upper body with stiff, robotic movements. Slowly, heavily, he slumped into the seat directly across the aisle from me. In the glass mirror, he was sitting right there. His obscured, shadowy face was angled directly toward mine. Then, the situation escalated into pure, unfiltered psychological horror. He didn't just sit there. In the reflection, he slowly began to lift his head. The brim of the soaked, ruined hat shifted upward, and the shadows fell away. His skin was bloated, a waxy, translucent, sickly grayish blue, the color of a drowned corpse pulled from a freezing river. His jawline was marred by deep, horrific, jagged lacerations, the flesh torn to expose the pale gleam of bone. But his eyes shattered my sanity. They were milky white, clouded over with death, yet blown wide in a state of eternal, frozen panic. And those milky, dead eyes were looking directly, unmistakably at me. He wasn't just a residual echo playing back a loop. He was aware. He saw me watching him. A putrid, suffocating stench suddenly invaded the carriage, overpowering Elena's perfume. It was the smell of ozone, rusted iron, stagnant swamp water, and the heavy, sickening metallic tang of coagulated blood. It flooded my nostrils, causing my stomach to heave. In the mirror, the dead man slowly leaned forward, breaching the physical space between us. He raised a mangled, dripping hand reaching incredibly slowly across the aisle toward my reflection's face. His fingers were broken, pointing in unnatural directions. A single, freezing drop of water fell from his outstretched hand in the reflection and landed squarely, physically, agonizingly cold on my actual, physical cheek. The physical shock of the icy water shattered my paralysis. The dam broke. I let out a guttural, involuntary scream of pure terror and violently whipped my head around to look across the aisle, throwing my arms up over my face. The seat was totally empty. There was no dead man. There was no heavy, soaked wool overcoat. There was no puddle of swamp water on the floor. The blue fabric of the seat was completely undisturbed, perfectly dry, and utterly vacant. I slapped a frantic hand to my cheek. My skin was bone dry, yet the phantom sting of freezing, dirty water still burned against my pores. "Hey," I shouted into the empty car, stumbling backward into the aisle. "Get away!" "Who's there?" Elena jolted awake with a sharp gasp, her eyes flying open in absolute alarm. She looked around wildly, disoriented by my screaming. "Artie!" she yelled, her voice thick with panic. "Artie, what is it? What's wrong? Did you see him?" I demanded, my chest heaving, scanning the front and rear of the carriage like a cornered animal. "The man! He just walked down the aisle! I saw him in the window!" He reached for me. Elena stared at the empty seat, then at the empty aisle, then at my pale, sweating face. Her expression rapidly shifted from fear to deep concern. She reached out and firmly grasped my wrist. Her hand was warm, so beautifully, painfully alive, grounding me slightly. "Artie, honey, stop. Look around," she said softly, keeping her voice incredibly calm. "There is no one here. We've been the only people in this car since London. You're exhausted. You've been working 70-hour weeks. You had a night terror, a micro-sleep." "I wasn't asleep, Elle," I insisted, my voice cracking. I pulled away and walked hesitantly down the aisle toward the rear doors. I pressed my trembling hands against the cold glass and peered into the next carriage. It was perfectly, terrifyingly empty. I dropped to my knees and looked at the linoleum floor. Bone dry, no wet footprints. The bloody stench was completely gone. "Come sit down," Elena pleaded gently, wrapping her arms around me and guiding me away. "We're almost at our station. Please, you're scaring me." I sank heavily into my seat, absolutely refusing to look anywhere near the window. I spent the last 15 agonizing minutes staring firmly at my own violently shaking hands. When the train finally squealed into our station, I practically dragged Elena off the carriage before the doors had fully opened. We walked home in silence. The moment we stepped inside, I locked the front door, bolted it, and moved through the house like a madman, violently drawing every curtain and snapping shut every blind, completely erasing the dark windows from sight. I told Elena she was right, that I had hallucinated from exhaustion. She went upstairs to bed, but I could not sleep. The primal part of my brain knew exactly what it had witnessed. The sheer physical weight of the entity in that reflection, the cold, the smell, the impossible drop of water. It could not be explained away. By the time the gray light of dawn bled through the curtains, a dark obsession had taken root. At exactly 700 a.m., I quietly slipped downstairs, brewed a pot of brutally strong coffee, and opened my laptop. I didn't know exactly what I was searching for, but I knew where it started. I opened a search engine and typed Blackwood Cross fatal accident. I aggressively filtered out the mundane delays and teenage vandalism, pushing deep into the digital archives of the County Chronicle. Hours bled away. My eyes burned from the relentless blue light, and then, just past 11:30 a.m., my heart stopped completely dead in my chest. It was a small article tucked away in an archive from exactly 7 years ago. The headline was stark: TRG Fidoleoityatba Fiebuo Rasid local man struck and killed on late-night commuter line. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely double. Click to zoom in. Authorities have confirmed a tragic incident on the late-night railway line just outside of Blackwood Cross. Sometime shortly after midnight on Tuesday, an individual was struck and killed instantly by the 11:45 p.m. commuter train arriving from London, Victoria. The victim has been identified as Arthur Pendleton, 58. Neighbors stated Mr. Pendleton had been struggling with severe grief following the sudden loss of his wife, often taking long, solitary walks late at night. The train conductor reported seeing a tall figure standing motionless on the tracks. Due to the torrential rainstorm reducing visibility and the heavy, black wool overcoat the victim was wearing, he blended right into the dark. I slammed the brakes, but the train just slid. Medical examiners noted that alongside catastrophic injuries, Mr. Pendleton suffered from a pronounced, severe limp caused by an old industrial accident, which likely hindered his ability to clear the tracks. The air in my office turned to ice. A heavy, black wool overcoat, a torrential rainstorm, a severe limp, a mangled face. The description was flawless. It was a one-to-one mirror of the dripping, miserable figure I had seen in the glass. The ghost of Arthur Pendleton. A violent wave of nausea washed over me. But then, my panicked eyes darted up to the top right corner of the newspaper page to check the publication date. October 14th. I mechanically pulled my phone from my pocket and checked today's date. Wednesday, October 14th. I looked back at the article. Sometime shortly after midnight on Tuesday, It hadn't just been on the exact same stretch of track. It hadn't just been the exact same late-night train. It was the exact same day. Exactly 7 years ago, to the very hour. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just haunting the physical tracks. He was trapped in a perpetual, agonizing loop of his final moments. His shattered spirit had somehow boarded the very machine that killed him. And every year, on the exact anniversary of his violent death, he boards that late-night carriage, soaking wet from a phantom storm, endlessly walking the aisle, looking for a seat to finally rest his broken body. I slammed the laptop shut with a violent crack. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing my own terrified reflection staring back at me from the glossy black monitor. Since that night, my life has fundamentally fractured. I immediately sold my commuter rail pass and bought a second car, now enduring a 2-hour drive into the city every day. Elena thinks I've developed an irrational phobia of public transport, and I let her believe it. I would rather she think my mental health is slipping than burden her with the terrifying truth. But the fear didn't stop at the train station. It followed me home. Because the real horror isn't just knowing that ghosts exist, or that they are forced to endlessly repeat their bloody tragedies. The real, soul-crushing horror is knowing how they manifest. I can no longer be in a room with an uncovered window after the sun goes down. When evening approaches, a desperate energy takes over me. I walk rapidly through my house, violently pulling curtains and snapping blinds tight, ensuring not a single inch of glass is left exposed to the dark. Because I know now that windows in the dark are not for looking out into the world. They are black mirrors, and every time I accidentally catch my reflection in a darkened pane of glass, I am paralyzed by the suffocating dread that the reflection of the room behind me won't be empty. I live my life in constant, agonizing fear that one night I will look into the glass of my own living room window and I will see a tall man in a dripping wet, black wool overcoat. I fear I will see his dead, milky eyes lock onto mine, and I will have to watch helplessly in the reflection as he slowly drags his shattered leg across my carpet, coming to sit in the empty chair right beside me.